Did the Khilafat movement actually have an impact over India's freedom struggle, or was it just another publicity stunt by Mr. Gandhi? Was the movement really necessary, and did it actually unite Indians? Okay. Okay, a question about history. The Khilafat movement. What was this Khilafat movement? It was a movement to restore the Islamic caliphate. The caliphate is an institution in Islam, and whoever is the caliph, the khalifa, whatever they call it, is the ruler of all Muslims worldwide. Historically, it's been that way. So you've had various caliphates in the past, the Umayyad Caliphate and the Rashidun Caliphate, and various other caliphates, and eventually the Ottoman Caliphate, which was the last great caliphate. So the caliphs have ruled from Baghdad, they've ruled from Cairo, they've ruled from Mecca or Medina, one of these two cities, and eventually from Constantinople, Istanbul. Right? So ever since the Ottoman Empire became a major force, the Ottoman emperor, whoever it was, declared himself to be the caliph, and then this institution continued with the Ottoman Sultanate. So whoever was the Ottoman king, after whichever one was the person who started this, whoever was the Ottoman emperor would also be called the caliph, and the caliphate was based out of Constantinople. Now, in the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was on its last legs. It had become an extremely corrupt and powerless institution. The caliph's power was limited just to his palace and his harem, essentially. And in the 1920s or somewhere, I think 21, 22, or maybe 1919, after the end of the Second World War, or when the World War was First World War, and when the First World War was ending, the great Turkish general Mustafa Kemal Ataturk announced his intention to abolish the caliphate, to abolish the institution of the caliph. And after the Turkish War of Independence, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk actually abolished the caliphate, and he expelled the last Ottoman emperor and caliph out of Turkey. And today, the descendants of the Ottoman emperors, they live in the US and other countries in the West. Okay. So Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the Turkish dictator who then became the dictator, he abolished the caliphate. And this caused a global outcry among the Muslims of the world, because they loved their caliph and whatever, I don't know. So in India, a number of prominent Muslim politicians, etc., they launched a movement called the Khilafat movement, which was a movement to restore the caliphate. And the objective was to unify the Muslims of India. They knew that sitting in India, and Turkey is so far away, Constantinople is so far away, we can't really have a say in what happens, but let's launch a movement to bring awareness among Indian Muslims and to unify Indian Muslims in a common cause. And there were a number of Muslim politicians involved in this. So Mr. Mohandas Gandhi, he said, wow, what a wonderful thing. Let us also participate in this matter. So Mr. Gandhi said that we support the Congress party supports the Khilafat movement. Okay. And Mr. Gandhi was a very prominent politician by that time. And so he brought the Khilafat movement into the mainstream consciousness of India. Until that time, it was just a fringe kind of movement. Some politicians were pushing for it, and their great objective was to unify the Indian Muslims through this movement. But nobody knew about those politicians. I forget the names of the politicians. Many of them eventually became a big deal because of Mr. Gandhi's support. So this was a fringe movement. Nobody in India knew or cared about this, and it had no impact. It had no relevance in India. What happens in Constantinople has no relevance in India, especially in the 1920s. And it had nothing to do with the Indian freedom struggle at all. It had nothing to do with the British occupation of India and the British oppression and destruction of India's economy and all that. Nothing. It had nothing to do with us. But Mr. Gandhi, in his wisdom, said that we need to support this movement. So he brought this obscure fringe movement into the mainstream. And he told everybody, all Indians who supported him, that we must support the Khilafat movement. So everybody started supporting it. And it made those obscure politicians who started the movement in India, it made them into a very big deal. Eventually, they became the leaders of the partition movement of India. Many of them. Okay, they would have been they would have remained in obscurity had Mr. Gandhi not elevated them out of nothingness into the national mainstream. And most Indians who were supporting this movement, they had no idea what this movement was. Khilafat sounds like khilaf, which means against, right? So most Indians thought that it's a movement to oppose the British. It is in khilaf of the British. So let's support this movement. Most Indians had no idea. They had no idea this was a movement to support an Islamic caliphate. They had no idea it was a movement in support of Sharia law and so on and so forth. Okay, they had no idea about this. So Mr. Gandhi just led everybody along. It essentially was the germination of the movement for India's partition. The Khilafat movement became the partition movement. The idea of partition may have started in the 19th century in the minds of one or two people, and they wrote about this and so on. But such a movement never became mainstream until Mr. Gandhi brought it into the mainstream. So this movement was not necessary at all. Mr. Gandhi's his support for this movement was, I just don't understand the logic. Why was it needed to do this? It was not necessary. It did not unite Indians. Those who supported Mr. Gandhi supported the movement. It was not a movement that united Indians, but it brought the anti-nationals into prominence. It gave them tremendous political capital. It brought them into the national mainstream consciousness, and it gave them the political capital to start the partition movement. And that's what eventually led to the partition of India. Yeah. And I have this talk on YouTube on another channel called The Turkish Origins of India's Partition. Maybe I should revisit that and do that again for this channel. Yeah. Anyhow, good question, Shraddha.